Once upon a time there lived a boy who was adopted by an old couple. He was already a grown child of 12 when he was adopted. He never imagined he could leave the orphanage where he lived for 12 years of his life. People often come in to adopt a child or two now and then, but they never seemed to notice him there. Peter had already given up the hope of ever getting a parent like the other kids he always sees with their parents. Although he never felt intimidated by them, he rather wished for a couple who would take care of him too. When Peter turned 12, he put aside his hope of getting adopted and tried not to think of it. He decided to push this hope aside because the age range of children he had seen getting adopted ranges from 1 to 9. Most get lucky at 10. Peter was a calm kid. He was humble and obedient. He loved all his friends and was kind to them. His reputation was one to reckon with. He was known for his sincerity and kind nature. He loved to make people laugh. Most evenings he would gather the children and tell them interesting stories, which he read from the books supplied to them by good Samaritans, who donated now and then to the orphanage. His best friend, Michael, was adopted when he was 7, leaving him to himself and the other kids. Peter was pained by this, but he was also happy that Michael had gotten a new home. Due to his good attitude, he was always asked to go to Mrs. Rias's house to deliver some dog food. The orphanage raises dogs, and because old Mrs. Ria and her husband had a dog called Bingo, she had asked the orphanage to supply some of their dog food to her dog. In turn, she would pay them a huge sum of money.
The orphanage needed all the support they could get, so they were delighted with this offer. Peter was asked to take the dog food to Mrs. Ria, whenever it was time, which he would carry on his shoulder happily and deliver to them. Old Mrs. Ria and her husband had a little boy of the same age as Peter living with them. Tony was a child to their eldest son who lived far away from home due to his kind of job. Tony was a bully. He would always bully Peter whenever he came with the dog food. Peter didn't respond to his bull why. Sometimes, Tony and his friends who were just like him would push him and call him names. "Hey homeless boy, why don't you get yourself some dog food if you are hungry? After all, the food is meant for dogs like you." Bastard Tony would cuss. But Peter always tried his best to ignore him and his friends who would laugh and scorn him more. Peter was always hurt when they called at him names. But he wouldn't want to retort. One day, Mrs. Ria heard them cussing at Peter while she was in the garden behind her house watering the garden. She rushed into the house in time to see two of Tony's friends about to hit him. She shouted at them. "Stop it," she yelled. They both became frightened and ran away. "You better watch your friend's attitude, else I would have to stop them from coming here," she told Tony. "Why me, Grandma? I was just standing here. I wasn't the one cussing." Mrs. Ria walked up to Peter where he stood and bent over him. "Are you okay, dear?" she asked Peter. "Yes, I'm fine," he replied. "Come, and have some pancakes and strawberry tea with me, will you?" she asked Peter. "No, Mrs. Ria, I should be leaving now, I've just come to deliver the dog food." "Oh, thank you, Peter, you are such a great child. God bless you, dear child." She patted his hair. Tony didn't like this. He gazed at them with irritation and jogged off to his room. Tony stopped when he heard her plead with him to make some pancakes and give some to the other kids at the orphanage. He was pissed off and almost cried, but then an idea came to him and he left his room through the window in his room. Peter walked home gleefully. Wrapped in his hand were the well-packed pancakes he would be glad to share with the kids. The orphanage was just a few feet from Mrs. Ria's home and it was a pleasure for him to carry out this errand. Suddenly, someone pulled him up and immediately hid the packaged pancakes from his hands. 5 friends of Tony and Tony himself stood there laughing and pointing at the pancakes which were all scattered everywhere on the ground. "Who's gonna have pancakes now?" Tony bullied, and they all burst into laughter. Peter looked at the scattered pancakes on the ground. He turned and kept walking towards the orphanage. They didn't go away. They kept following him and cursing at him, pushing him from side to side. At some point, he was pushed to the ground and the sound of their laughter increased. Peter didn't know why Tony hated him so much. He thought of a reason but could not arrive at one. He couldn't understand anything. "Perhaps it's because I don't have a parent," he thought. Whenever he took the dog food to Mrs. Rhea, he would always watch out for Tony and his group of bullies. He didn't know how to stop them, but he was glad that Mrs. Rhea took note of Tony's attitude towards him and made sure to be around each time he delivered the dog food if she could. But Tony would still get to him as he walked to the orphanage. Peter would run off after leaving Mrs. Rhea's presence. Sometimes he would make it home, but sometimes he would be waylaid by Tony and his group. Still, he wouldn't complain or respond to Tony and his group of bullies. Miss Agatha, a reverend sister at the orphanage home, always used Peter as a good example when she is correcting another child for a wrong act. This made most of the children envious of him. Still, others learned from his good behavior. Many people around the neighborhood loved him. Sometimes he was seen helping an old person cross a busy road. Other times he would give a little child a hug to comfort them. He always talked softly and people had no choice but to love him.
One day, after delivering dog food to Mrs. Rhea, Peter got home only to have Miss Agatha send for him to meet her in her office. He got to her office, surprised to see Tony and his grandparents. They all turned towards him when he walked in. Peter couldn't understand anything, but decided to wait to find out why he was needed here in Miss Agatha's office. It was Miss Agatha who spoke first.
Peter, I'm sure you are quite familiar with Mr. Oliver and his family. There is something we need to know from you, and I want you to speak truthfully. Tony, could you repeat what you just told us?
With pleasure.
I was in my room taking a nap when I heard some footsteps. I got up quietly and peeped through the keyhole on my door. I saw him.
Who?
I mean, Peter. He was acting all weird and always looking behind, like he was snooping around. I hid behind the curtains and watched him go into Grandma's room. Right then, I wanted to know what he was doing in there, so I started toward Grandma's room. But he came out again, in a hurry this time, and left the house in so much haste.
He didn't see you?
No, because I hid again behind the curtains.
Why didn't you stop him and try to find out what he was doing in that room?
Tony opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't say a word. Shocked, Peter spoke.
I never went upstairs to Mrs. Rhea's room. I dropped the dog food by the side of the house, as I've always done. I've never gone beyond that point. When there's no one in sight.
He is lying.
Well, Mrs. Rhea's huge sum of money went missing, and Tony had said you were seen snooping around the house. Did you maybe see anything suspicious that might help us get to this thief?
No, I didn't see anyone when I got there. If Mrs. Rhea hadn't told me to keep the food inside the house, or at least near the door, I would have just left it outside. But she had asked me nicely to keep it inside the house.
Okay, I'm calling the police.
Tony became agitated and started sweating when he heard the police. Mrs. Rhea studied Tony.
Yes, I think bringing in the police would help to fish out the real thief. But if this thief could speak the truth, he could be forgiven and be free from the police.
She said as she continued to study Tony's countenance. A sweat broke out on his forehead. He placed his palms together and squeezed them nervously.
Right. Call the police now since no one is telling the truth, and let the police arrest the thief and take him to prison for a long time.
Mrs. Ria added. Mr. Oliver brought out a mobile phone from his pants pocket and proceeded to dial a number when Tony spoke. He said,
I have something to say.
Go ahead.
Mrs. Ria urged him.
Maybe we should search Grandma's room one more time. It's quite likely to still be there somewhere.
Oh no. There's no need for that. I've searched everywhere I keep my money, but it is simply not there anymore. Go ahead and call the police.
She said as she turned to Mr. Oliver. Mr. Oliver had already dialed the police number and was telling someone on the line to come to the orphanage for the arrest of a thief. Tony's face became red, and it was vivid for all to see, but still, he didn't change his report.
After a while, the police arrived at the orphanage, and they were ushered into Miss Agatha's office. The neighbors were agitated when they saw the police entering the orphanage. They rarely see uniformed men around since the environment has always been a peaceful one. When the matter was reported to the police, they asked that both kids be taken to the police station for proper interrogation. The kids were brought out by the police and were headed to the police's van when the neighbors and some orphans gathered around them.
Let Peter go. He didn't steal anything.
One woman spoke first. They blocked the two police, stopping them from proceeding into the van.
As much as I would love to oblige your request, I have no choice but to take them away for now. They will come back after a while. You see, it's just for proper questioning.
One of the policemen replied.
Well, that can be done here.
Another person yelled from the crowd.
Besides, the child you are holding can't do something of that sort. One look at him and you'll see it. Please let Peter go. He is innocent.
How did you know?
Asked a policeman.
Because I know Peter very well.
Yes, Peter has never stolen or done anything like that. He is innocent.
Another person supplied.
He may be innocent, but I promise you all that he will be back sooner than you think. Don't worry,
Said the policeman.
Please, my beloved brothers and sisters, we all know that our sweet Peter can never do a thing like that which he has been accused of. We know that he is an angel and full of nothing but love and the Spirit of God in him. I know and believe that he will come back soon after he has been proven innocent. So, brethren, let them go. And have faith that our dear Peter shall be back safely.
Miss Agatha pleaded with them.
Well, in that case, we will wait here for his return. And if he doesn't show up soon, we will be visiting you at your station.
Yelled someone in the crowd. Yes, the crowd roared. The crowd started giving way, one after the other, murmuring and grumbling aloud as they were dispatched gradually. The policeman thanked Miss Agatha for her help and took them both into the van, then drove off. The crowd didn't leave. They lingered around the premises. Mrs. Ria and her husband were amazed to see this amount of love shown to Peter. Just then, she saw a little child from the orphanage, who was crying. She went to him and asked,
Why are you crying, little angel? Don't cry.
she said, patting his hair.
I want my Peter. He didn't do anything wrong. My Peter is a good boy. He always gives me a part of his biscuit.
Mrs. Rhea pondered, this is strange. How could so many people care about this one person this much? She looked at someone else. This was a child with parents that refused to go home for lunch because, according to her, Peter hadn't had lunch. Mrs. Rhea went into the orphanage and straight to Miss Agatha's office. Something caught her attention as she passed by an open hall that led to her office. A group of kids had gathered to pray. The captivating thing about this prayer was that it was for Peter. Because she heard his name in the quiet prayers they were offering. She sighed and continued walking. She knocked and opened the office door. But she had to wait for Miss Agatha to finish addressing some kids who were there. To Mrs. Rhea's horror, it was about Peter too. The kids had come to know why Peter was taken by the police and when he would come back. After they left, Mrs. Rhea took a seat by the table in the office. She sighed again and began.
Well, Miss Agatha, it's clear how this whole saga has disrupted the atmosphere around here. But what I don't understand is why so many people care so much about this little boy. Of course, I know he is kinda cute and all, but please don't get me wrong though, I just want to know something. Is there something else about this child that I don't know about?
Miss Agatha smiled and said,
This boy is a good kid. He is pure and does good and kind deeds innocently and effortlessly because that's just who he is. He has this nature of sharing love and kindness with everyone. He had managed to build and gain the trust of many over the years with his sweetness.
Well, if he was this sweet, how come he never got adopted by one of those out there who knew all of these attributes of his?
The thing is that Peter has so many proposals for adoption from many couples. But I and the rest of us here just don't want to let him go. You see, Mrs. Rhea, many kids here have changed from bad to good just by looking at him. He exchanges love for hatred. He is simply a great child. The orphanage needs him around.
But don't you think he might want to have a proper home? Have you asked him this to know if he wants to stay or go to a real home?
Miss Agatha opened her mouth to say something, when suddenly, there was an uproar outside.
What's going on? What's with the noise?
Asked Mrs. Rhea.
I will go and find out,
said Miss Agatha. They both went outside to see.
Peter,
exclaimed Miss Agatha as she rushed down to him and hugged him amidst the crowd. One of the policemen was standing close to him.
I told you he was innocent.
Someone in the crowd spoke.
What happened? Has the missing money been found yet?
Mr. Oliver, who has been hanging around studying the crowd who never gave up on little Peter, asked.
Yes, we have. Your grandson, Tony, had stolen the money and handed it to one of his friends to keep for him. His friend did keep it safe. And, here it is.
The policeman said, handing a bunch of money to Mr. Oliver.
For whatever reason, this money was stolen to frame Peter here. Your son doesn't seem to like him very much.
oh dear, poor Peter.
Mrs. Rhea exclaimed and turned to Peter.
Son, I'm so sorry for all this. Please forgive us if you can.
She said and wiped off the tears in her eyes.
It's okay, Mrs. Rhea. I'm glad they found your money.
Mrs. Rhea looked at him adorably and hugged him tenderly. A week later, Mr. Rhea and her husband signed the document that gave them parental rights over Peter. They adopted Peter as their son. As they left the orphanage, the neighbors hugged him in turns, while some waved at him and others wiped the tears from their eyes. They were all going to miss him and his kindness. But Mrs. Rhea had promised to let him visit the orphanage during the holidays and spend a few days with them. Sometimes. Peter had mixed feelings as he parted with the people he had grown up loving. But he was excited to start a new life with his new parents. He had always wished to have one but never knew it would ever be possible. But his good attitude has made it happen, according to Miss Agatha.
Thank you, God.
He muttered, looking at the sky. Tony was bailed out of police custody 2 days after he was arrested. His father sent him home and took him far away from his grandparents. He was ashamed of himself when he saw how everyone loved Peter for his good attitude. And now he will be his relative. He felt remorseful and apologized to him in the presence of his family. They forgave him before he left with his dad. Although he was later asked to stay back if he wanted to, he said he wouldn't be able to stand the humiliation the theft incidents had brought him. Most kids called him a thief and other shameful names because of what he did to Peter. Tony's attitude of bullying stopped and he tried to be a good boy too. This also affected his other friends positively, and they started exhibiting good attitudes too. Even after Tony left, he still came back to celebrate with them during festive periods like Christmas, Halloween, and the likes. Tony, up to this day, would always tell those around him of a boy who changed his life positively and made him a good person.
I fear that the thoughts build up until I can't hear, that my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. Anxiety